tombonay toa avao mila azy, tombonay reo avao mila azy. Zahay manao azy haly satria haly iny mampiboaka azy. Anarako Razana Malala Eveliny. Zahay mipetraka Ambolimailaky. Zahay miasa zanga. Ny atao mizanga io miova zaho anay bakany. Andesinay amizay Anjiakeny. Aterinay Anjiakeny. Lafa zarany aminay, tsy alohanay jala fa omeany anay. Le harenay sasanay malio.
Les concombres de mer sont des organismes qui sont très intrigants. Ils ont une façon de vivre qui, la journée, ils sont dans le sédiment, ils sont dans le sable, donc ça, on ne voit pas. La nuit, ils sortent pour se nourrir. Donc ils ont un cycle qui est quand même assez particulier. Ils ont un cycle de vie aussi qui est particulier. Ils ont des 3 premières phases de vie qui sont pélagiques, donc ils vivent dans la colonne d'eau. Après, ils se fixent sur le sédiment. Une demande du marché asiatique pour la consommation humaine. Ils le consomment séché et après ils le réhydratent et après ils l'incorporent dans leur plat. Ça a été une espèce qui a été très fortement pêchée, principe aussi à Madagascar, sur les côtes malgaches. Et donc jusqu'au moment où le stock sauvage était presque très limité et presque inexistant. Et donc c'est à partir de ce moment-là que les chercheurs se sont intéressés à sa reproduction. Et par la suite, on s'est rendu compte que c'était possible de mettre en place. Voilà.
Sea cucumber is very important for the ecosystems. The Holoturia scabra species that we are breeding, that we are farming, is living on the seagrass meadow, and it is eating sediment. So it is recycling the organic matters in the sediment, and it's like treating the pollution in the sediment, organic pollution in the sediment, which is also providing new foods for the vegetables, for example. The main benefits of cultivating many species in the same area, first of all, is social benefits and economic benefits. Because the communities can do at the same time sea cucumber, seaweed, coral, or fish farming at the same time. So all these, let's say, different trophic level animals and plants aquacultured will kind of should equilibrate the ecosystem itself. Some of them produce more organic matters, some of them produce more CO2, while the others use CO2 to produce their organic matter, so it's kind of recycling the nutrients in this area.
The climate change already affects the people. In this sense, people living inland in the south started decades ago, and it's still happening now, to move from land to coastal area. If they are fishing, they may spend like 3 hours per day, or going fishing 3-4 times per week, and sometimes they can come back with no captures, with nothing, so no revenues. But when they started aquaculture, sea cucumber farming or seaweed farming, they got more stable revenues, more regular revenues, so they don't need to risk their lives going to fishing. And most importantly, they can negotiate to groceries or shops. They can contract debt.
Fa misy zay mahazo eninaly. Eninaly iny zaranay roe. Piambiko gardieko i 3 aly. Zaho koa tompo zanga ao 3 aly. Lafa azoko anaovako anako mianatsy reo.
scientists say that corals are animals, and they are, because they have a mouth, they have nerves, they have little arms that grab and catch things in the water to feed on. And so they are animals, tiny animals called polyps, make up a coral skeleton. So they're colonial animals, so you'll have multiple polyps on a skeleton, and they work together as one single, like a small city, right? All working together. Well, coral bleaching is actually a very new phenomenon. People have been living with coral reefs, working with coral reefs for hundreds of years, and it's never been seen that the corals have turned white. And in 1982, Dr. Peter Glynn in Panama, the water got very hot, 29 or 30, quite hot. And all the corals on the reef in Panama turned white. And the first time they thought the corals, algae was running away from the coral. And now they found out that bleaching, the coral actually kicks the algae out. Because in bleaching, the water becomes hot, and instead of the photosynthesis reaction producing sugar, it produces hydrogen peroxide, and the algae is kicked out. And now the coral can't get most of its energy, and he starves to death. Are you finished already? I have an idea, a new idea, and it's called translocation. It's, can we move these heat-adapted corals from where it gets to 34 every summer? Can we move them to where it only gets to 28 or 29? I thought we had 20 years, but we don't. I am scared right now. I am afraid because something has happened that I didn't expect, that nobody expected. Suddenly, it's like the Earth's thermostat broke. Suddenly, I don't know what happened, but on top of all this global warming that's been slowly coming up, suddenly something happened to kick the temperatures to a higher level that no one has ever predicted, and we are shocked. If we lose the corals, we lose beauty. We lose tourism. But the sand on this beach we lose, because this is coral sand produced from that reef. So we lose the corals, that's the house of the fish. We lose the fish, that's the source of the sand. We lose the corals, that's the source of the whole geology, and entire nations are built by those corals. As we work for unity in the big, big, deep blue sea. In the big, big, deep blue sea.
And we've been growing more and more sectors of seaweed. So, Sam, how did your weekend go in terms of the raising and lowering of the platform?
Right now we're out at our experimental site. We're out at the 6 by 7 metre platform in Compostela. We're about 3 kilometres off the coast of Compostela here, and it's in about 220 metres deep water in this location. What we do is we lower the seaweed into that cool range. It's around 23 degrees. It's full of nutrients down at that level as well. So at night time, we lower the seaweed down to the 120 metre mark. It sucks up all of the nutrients and cold water. And then during the day, we lift it up to the surface and it gets its photosynthesis. Since the ocean temperatures are rising so much, we're up to the 32, 33 degree temperature range. and it's not sustainable to grow seaweed. At that stage, the seaweed develops a disease. It's called ice, and just falls apart. So with the depth cycling, we've noted that we're getting much better growth, or we're actually growing seaweed. We can get it up to 5% a day in some instances.
1.9.
Because of that, the farmers here can only really grow 6 months a year when it's the colder season. And in turn, it's not really worth doing a business if you can only do it for half a year. So this gives the local farmers a ability to grow all year around and provide for their teams and their family. Initially, we started doing a bit of upwelling. So we had a pipe running down to the bottom of the sea and had a valve in it. So we were doing a bit of pumping with wave action, but on days like this, it's not very beneficial and we could kill the seaweed. So we found that this is a much better approach.
My vision is to expand our production not only in Bohol, but to the other island in the Philippines, because they have also their seaweeds there, because the demand is very high. I am thinking that even here in Bohol, if all the farmers in Bohol will use the product, I think the supply of seaweeds in Bohol cannot supply our demand here. That's why we are really serious in making research how to farm seaweeds with this kind of environment. Climate condition is here in the Philippines because I met Dr. Brian von Hersen in Africa. Then I was thinking that this organization is really can help in the Philippines in terms of the research how to produce more seaweeds, because our production of seaweeds in the Philippines is really declining because of this global warming.
We're going to be building these platforms or these seaweed growing systems and giving them away or renting them to the farmer, having an exclusive agreement to purchase all of their seaweed off of them at a fair rate, and then we turn that into a biostimulant. Brian's vision, is he's a good guy. He's got his head in the right place for sure. Looking out for the earth. 1 hectare of seaweed is equivalent to around 10 hectares of rainforest. So, got to be doing the right thing there somewhere.
Key development in improving the hectare by hectare economic sustainability for thousands of communities around the world, enabling us to build out hectare scale marine permaculture globally and really help to regenerate life in the sea, food security for billions of people, and ultimately measuring the carbon export. We think it's 12 years to a gigaton. If all goes well, and we can triple the area under deep water irrigation each year for the next 12 years.